guys, Tyler Forrester for runitoncE.com. Today we're going to be looking at situations where I called 3-bets. We start here with 10-8 of spades. And as you can imagine, I'm going to call a 3-bet. Blind versus blind here, when you're looking at the pre-flop raiser, this is going to be one of the widest situations for him. And because this situation's so wide for the pre-flop 3-better, we definitely can expand our calling range in this situation. So something like 10-8, I'm actually marginally happy about, because I could have close to 50% equity against his range, depending how it's constructed. A lot of players, especially in anonymous pools, tend to 3-bet a lot of air in this situation, mainly because they don't know what else to do with it. And oftentimes, if you're facing someone who's aggressively opening in the small blind, one of the counter strategies you should start to explore is 3-betting more aggressively. Now, it turns out that 3-betting more aggressively in that situation means that you can 3-bet wider for value. It generally doesn't mean initially that you can 3-bet wider as a bluff. The reason why that's true is because ultimately, even though if I opened up 100% from the small blind and I was facing a raise from the big blind, I could still call enough there to make something like 7-deuce indifferent. And I probably could even still call enough there to make something like 10-6 off or 10-6 suited indifferent. What I couldn't make indifferent in that situation would be something like ace-10 off, where ace-10 would normally be generally a flat or maybe a marginal 3-bet in this situation. Then it has to be a profitable 3-bet against someone who's opening up too widely in the small blind, because they have a lot of extra hands in their range, which increases ace-10 off's equity. Now, a lot of players, though, don't make that adjustment in that way. What they tend to do instead is maybe a little bit more of an emotional reaction and throw more of the 7-5 off, 7-4 off combos into the 3-betting ranges, because they don't necessarily feel comfortable calling it. And at the same time, they feel like they have to play it. So one of the solutions there is, of course, to 3-bet. And because I open up pretty aggressively in the small blind, it's probably a reaction I see more than most players in the big blind shoes. Because of this, I tend to flat 3-bets very widely from the small blind, and essentially it's the right play against someone who's going to be 3-betting just random 2 cards against me in this situation. So 10-8 suited here oftentimes has more equity than we would suspect in this spot. I'm actually reasonably happy at this point to call the 3-bet. On this board texture, there's nothing really that I can do in this situation. I don't have any tricks up my sleeve to win this pot. If I can win this pot with 10-8 suited in this situation, it means I can win this pot with any 2 cards, and my opponent's playing very, very badly. In general, in 3-bet pots, after calling, I assume that my opponent cares about the pot, wants to win the pot. All of those reasons make bluffing with complete air in these situations not it's an expensive play, because most players aren't going to overfold after they 3-bet you pre-flop, and certainly not overfold on a board texture that actually favors his range relatively heavily. So I've really got one option here, and you should see a check fold if he goes ahead and bets. Now that he's checking the turn, I tend to check back here most of the time, especially with this type of hand. Most players on this type of board texture are going to bet most of the time. So the fact that he didn't bet in this situation has alarm bells going off in my head. Essentially, a lot of players here are going to bet all their air because it's a very dry board texture, but check back maybe queens, check back kings occasionally, maybe check back aces with the ace of clubs, all with this idea that because this board is so dry, maybe he'll make a little bit more money inducing than he will by betting. If we looked at this from an equilibrium standpoint, we'd see that he would be auto betting in position on this type of board texture with a small sizing 100% of the time. So the fact that he's deviated off that really gives me 2 ideas. One is he's a super weak player and doesn't necessarily know what the equilibriums are in this situation. I guess the second one is he likes a bigger bet size on the flop. And then the third one is that he's trying to play some sort of trapping game. I usually see some sort of trapping game when he looks like a reg. If you look here, him starting with 100 big blinds, I would tend to assume that he likely was a reg, and so he bets the turn, and I go ahead and fold. All right, deuces on the button. We're going to continue our trend here of seeing me flat 3-bets. I think I think in this situation, it's relatively standard to flat basically any sizing with deuces. I'm not going to go too much more into the logic. This spot is a little bit interesting. It's actually changed over the past 5 years. Since as I started making videos for Run It Once, I'm nearing my 5th anniversary with Run It Once, which is pretty cool. If you see a bigger bet on this type of board texture, folding deuces is usually the right play. So if I was going to see a bet size between 10 and 15 big blinds, folding deuces would be at least equal value to calling in these situations. I maybe with the deuce of hearts, it would be slightly better to go ahead and call, but ultimately they're very close, and with 3 cards above 10 on the board, texture folding deuces would be the standard. However, once you start to decrease the bet sizings like you see here, where it's now a third pot, now essentially to compensate for the fact that he's getting such a good price on his bluff, I have to find more reasons to call in this situation. And deuces ends up being one of the best calls here against this sort of sizing that wouldn't be called against a larger sizing because of the amount of equity it can realize in the future. If I hit a deuce, I'm likely to win a very big pot. And then occasionally I'm going to get to showdown with this hand and win that way. And then finally, given the right card, maybe the 9 of hearts, turning this into a bluff is actually going to net me some money. So I've essentially got 3 ways to win this pot. I can show it down, I can hit my deuce, or I can hit a great bluffing card like an 8 or a 9 of hearts. Now, in general, if he's playing a GTO type game, I'm not going to make very much money calling here with deuces, though it's a necessity. I'm probably only going to make a couple of big blinds here over folding. However, if he's playing a non-GTO game, this value becomes substantially more. It might be 7 or 8 big blinds here. So you'll go ahead and see this call. And I hit my perfect turn card, which I'm very excited about. He goes ahead and bets 22 here, which leads me to believe that he may have looked a little bit at these situations, but hasn't dived in too deeply into this type of board texture. Generally with the paired boards, you want to see a slightly smaller sizing. So the fact he's betting 22 here is actually a little weird. If he was playing a more GTO game, you might see a smaller sizing or a check here most of the time. The fact that he's betting 22 is definitely would lead me to believe that he's probably a reg, but wouldn't lead me to believe that he's actually actively using Pio himself. He's probably getting this second hand. So with this sizing, deuces are obvious call. Really, my goal here when he bets 22 is to make sure that I create some sort of MDF that makes him indifferent to betting something like ace-king. So if we start as widely as deuces or something like ace-jack of clubs, I'm actually going to have to make some hero calls here with things like 8s and 7s, essentially to make sure I hit those MDFs. So we'll go ahead and call here. And then the ace of spades comes out, which the fact he's checking here is a little bit interesting. Generally, betting 22 there with kings is acceptable, but you'll net a little bit more money by betting smaller in that situation. He could have some sort of full house he's trapping. I'm not going to worry about it too much. Ultimately, with my full house, I'm going to go ahead and jam. It's a little bit more interesting here if I had an ace-10 type hand. I think given the general way that the player pool plays, jamming ace-10 here is pretty marginal. If I had something like a busted flush draw, I think jamming here is standard. And I might, if we start actually looking at combos, because I have so many jacks in this range, I might actually even have to rope, or I might have to draw in even some smaller pairs like 7s or 8s to bluff in this situation. So I'm just going to go ahead and jam. Pretty straightforward. And he ended up with ace-king in that situation. Apparently the replayer didn't pick it up. He essentially, his idea on the turn was by using this bigger bet size, he would encourage me to fold too often. I think that might be an okay bet against the player pool in that spot, but against me, it wasn't going to be that effective. And then on the river, he figures he can't get any more value, so he's going to bluff catch, which I think given the turn bet's probably fine. Though I'm going to try to structure my range to make a hand like ace-king indifferent in that situation by not jamming a hand like ace-10 and then balancing my ranges accordingly. So we have Jack 9 here. We're going to call a 3-bet. This is kind of an interesting spot and was one that I was just talking to another player about. Because he's a short stack, obviously calling here probably isn't as solid as some of the other options, but at 30 bigs, I need to develop some of a calling range. And now that I'm looking in through this in the replayer with big blinds involved, I probably had a close fold here, though it's obviously very close in value. The reason why it's so close in value is that my equity in this situation is still somewhere between 37 and 38, even if he's pretty tight here. And I'm getting basically 2-1 on my call, and then I guess I have some applied odds with the 21 big blinds. If we break this down in a case basis, by a case-by-case basis, though, what we're going to see is folding and calling are within a half a big blind of each other. And thankfully, I don't have to play this situation a lot, so whether I call or fold here isn't going to have a big effect on my win rate. Since we're calling in this situation, because that's the theme of the video, I now catch this situation where I have a open-ended straight draw and an overcard, and he essentially moves all in. Basically, if he ever has an overcard here, I'm going to have the right price to go ahead and call. So the decision was pre-flop rather than post. So we just see me go all in. I guess there's some argument for calling here in the fact that it's possible he folds for 5 big blinds at some point in the hand. And maybe I should be considering that in these situations. I don't generally, because the difference in EV is really negligible. We're talking probably less than $1. And I hit my straight, which is always a great thing to do. He had kings, which I think he played okay with them. I generally would have expected to see a smaller 3-bet from him to keep more of my range in. All right, king 3 of diamonds. And I'll press play here, and hopefully we'll get moving. Okay, so I do call the 3-bet. It's an 8 big blind 3-bet. This is the type of board texture where if I see a really small bet, I would generally need to defend, either by raising or calling. And the reason why I'd have to defend against a really small bet is ultimately the MDFs here are really important. So if I'm facing a small bet in these sorts of situations, I need to make sure I call enough so he doesn't gain a lot of value with those type of bluffs. One of the hands to add into a calling or raising range is this type of hand where I have a backdoor flush draw, I have a backdoor straight draw, and I have an overcard. So all of those things make it much more playable than some other parts of my range at this point in time. If I have to pick the top 75%, it's going to get into that top 75. This is another change from 5 years ago. Traditionally, this just would have been folded on the flop to a half pot size bet, and it still would be folded to that sizing. It's just we're far more likely to see smaller sizings at this point in time. So it's more common to have to play this hand. Now, with this gut shot, I decided to go ahead and lead. I'm still on the fence about this. I remember what happened in the hand. I think in general, leading in situations where I have a gut shot and an overcard against a check back, against a typical player on ignition, is a profitable play. That being said, if leading against a player who's decided to 3-bet pre and then check on a low board is probably not as strong a decision. Mainly because most players who check in these situations like to check down showdown value. And essentially, if I'm going to run a bluff in this situation, I think I have to run a very big bluff. And if I'm always running a bunch of big bluffs with things like king 3, I'm really going to be very imbalanced in this situation. Ultimately, open myself up to a lot of exploitation when you check back aces or jacks or queens. So I need to be a little bit hesitant here about really a very aggressive strategy. I do go ahead and lead here, which I think if I was to do it again, I would probably go closer to pot in this situation. Under the idea that by going closer to pot, I would be setting up a little bit easier jam and really putting him to a harder decision with his bluff catchers. By choosing this 9.64 sizing, I think I let his bluff catchers off the hook a little bit in the fact that most of them are going to call very quickly and easily. Ultimately, though, with all my backdoors, if I fold out a king-queen type hand occasionally, this is probably fine. On the queen, I go ahead and bet smallish like I would continue with most of my jacks, because when he calls the turn, most of his range is 9s, 10s, 8s, 7s, maybe some 6s, maybe some 5s, maybe ace-king type hands. So obviously I'm going to be continuing with a lot of those types of hands. If I had ace-jack, king-jack, queen-jack even probably chooses this sizing. Jack 10, I guess, conceivably could, though wouldn't always. Any sort of queen X of spades chooses this sizing. So obviously I have this pretty big, broad range of value hands at this point in time. I think choosing something like king 3 to bluff here is okay. Essentially, I'm not going to have offsuit 8-7s. I'm not really going to have offsuit 9-7s. I might have some offsuit 9-8s, but they don't always start betting the turn. So I'm actually going to be scrapping here to get enough bluffs into my range, which makes king 3 appealing. It's obviously, though, a play that I'm trying to create some sort of equilibrium from him. I don't expect him to overfold to this sizing. And if we were actually going to dissect this play when we think about it from a value standpoint, the reason why I choose this sizing for value is because ultimately the in-position player is going to tend to overcall that sizing, especially if he's weaker. So maybe I shouldn't be choosing as often as a bluff, if that's essentially my read. Ideally, though, I want to create a lot of balance in these situations because I don't necessarily have a firm read whether he's going to call or fold sevens here. So when I do that, I need to make sure that I'm roughly close to equilibriums. So that's what I'm doing here with king 3 is I'm essentially trying to create an equilibrium where sevens is going to be very neutral between calling and folding rather than being a clear fold. And ultimately, I need to think a little bit about who I'm playing against, and maybe against this particular player, it wasn't the strongest play, though ultimately I think if we see a showdown here, it wasn't. His call actually isn't that bad in that situation, mainly because he doesn't block a spade and he blocks a little bit of my value range. If I had a set of sixes, maybe I'd lead that sizing and now I can't have it. Or if I had something like queen 6, maybe I would bet the turn and then, bet the river at that sizing. So ultimately, if he was going to choose a calling hand here, this is probably it. There were some other reads that ultimately convinced me that he was probably a recreational player in this situation.